Thank you for helping to pull these programs together. We really appreciate your work and your guidance, and our technical Zoom master, so that we can connect with classrooms. This is a new adventure, and I really want to acknowledge Donis Barkley. Donis is our education specialist. Donis came to us from Alabama, where she has been a classroom teacher for 26 years. And she came up with this idea of having conversations with authors of books about the Capitol and Congress and government, together with authors. And so today, we're reaching into the classroom. Those of you who are with your classroom, we are open to any kind of interesting question, any questions from the students, whatever comes onto their mind. I have had the opportunity to interview these two authors when the book very first came out, and I will tell you, they are fabulous, interesting, and characters. So this is the book. It's called The Suffragist Playbook. And they wrote this book because they both come from political families, and they thought it would be good to have a guide to changing the world. Let me tell you about our authors who are our speakers today. Lucinda Robb was the project director for Our Mothers Before Us, Women in Democracy, 1789 to 1920, at the Center for Legislative Archives. The project redirected thousands of overlooked original documents and produced a traveling exhibit and education program highlighting the role of women in American democracy. She also helped organize the National Archives celebration of the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 1995. She lives in Virginia with her husband, 3 children, 1 small barky dog, and more than 500 Pez dispensers, some of whom you will see in the background. Rebecca Boggs Roberts has been many things, including but not limited to a journalist, a producer, a tour guide, a forensic anthropologist, an event planner, a political consultant, a jazz singer, a radio talk show host. Currently, she is the curator of programming for Planet Word, a new museum in the historic Franklin School in downtown Washington. Rebecca Roberts lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, 3 sons, and a big fat dog. So we will let Rebecca and Lucinda talk with us about the Suffrage Playbook, your guide to changing the world, and you can tell us about your life in political families as well, if you wish.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having us today. I want to go back and start and say that August 26, 2020, 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And this is the constitutional amendment which granted women the right to vote, or if we're going to get really technical about it, it removed gender as an obstacle to voting. So it's a pretty big deal. And with everything that's going on right now in 2022, Becca and I think there's never probably been a better time to look back at the suffrage movement and see what we can learn from what the suffragists did back then. Now, one of the main things to keep in mind when you talk about the suffrage movement is just how incredibly long it was. It was over 70 plus years, and it went on for 3 generations. The first generations of suffragists, they all lived to a ripe old age. In fact, many of them lived into their mid-80s, but none of them lived to see the 19th Amendment passed. So for any of you today who think that change or things that you want to happen aren't happening fast enough, which is probably just about every activist, that right there is one of the big lessons, I think, of the suffrage movement. You really have to be in it for the long haul and never give up. In fact, one of the last things Susan B. Anthony said in his speech just days before she died was that failure is impossible. Never give up. And she should know. Probably the reason why a lot of people still know about Susan B. Anthony today, even if they can't name any other suffragists, is that she traveled around the country giving anywhere from 75 to 100 speeches a year for over 40 years. She was nonstop. And while she may be the most famous suffragist, there are hundreds of thousands of women and men, we'll talk about them later, who worked hard to make it happen. But on the plus side of all this waiting and all this time, it was the largest expansion of political power in US history. And it also managed to happen without any violent social upheaval or war, which again, giving everything happening in the world right now, we think is a pretty good idea. The suffragists trusted in the rights given to them by the Constitution, and they figured out how to work within the system. And the change they managed to create was permanent and enduring. And best of all, they left us a playbook on how to drive institutional change.
And that playbook aspect of this history was really important to Lucinda and me. We didn't just want to write a book that gave you a little lecture about how the suffrage movement happened and why it was important. We wanted to show that it was important in part because you can still learn from them. So if you want to change the world, and we super hope you do, because we want everybody to be active in whatever it is that matters to them, you can do a lot worse than looking at what the suffragists did and learn from them. Also, as Jane Campbell said, Lucinda and I are friends. Our moms were friends. Our grandmas were friends. We have been friends since before we were born. And all of those women that came before us were really politically active. And so we care a lot about American politics. We want it to succeed. We want it to be better. And because we're patriots, because we actually think politics can do good, we want everyone to know the ways to make it even better. So when we set out to write this book, we didn't want it to be strict and have a lot of lessons in it. We wanted it to be really practical. So it's called the Suffragist Playbook. The subtitle is Your Guide to Changing the World. We hope you'll take this book and go fix whatever needs fixing in your community, whether it's something like huge, like climate change, which is desperately in need of help, but is a massive generations long project, or getting a stop sign at the end of your block, or having some say in what books are in your school library, whatever it is. We hope you want to get involved in things, and we hope that you learn from the suffragists in order to do that. We also hope you sort of have a good time. The book is intentionally a little bit irreverent, a little bit conversational. It's easy to read. It's little. So we set out to write the kind of book that we thought our kids would like and that we would have liked it as kids. But we did do a ton of research. I mean, we didn't just sort of slap together a guidebook. We really do know our stuff. And I have to say, Lucinda, when you were, when we sort of split this up, it turned out Lucinda knew a lot more about the 19th century suffragists and I knew a lot more about the 20th century suffragists. So you get to know these women, right? You're reading their letters. You sort of feel like they're friends a little bit. Are there any women you found, Lucinda, that you felt like you personally identified with a lot?
Well, I tell you, one of the things that you talk about, and you had a great line in the book, and you say, we don't want you to look back and just think that these black and white photos of women are sort of, with their severe, hairdos and very
right, the lace caps, the whole thing.
Yeah, and they sometimes look very formidable, and you think, oh, I can't relate to them at all. But in fact, a lot of them, after you've read their letters, you've spent all the time reading their speeches and sort of getting to know them. I really do feel like some of these are people I went back to school with or something, and I know from an earlier time. In particular, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is someone who's always seemed particularly real to me. She was one of the big thinkers and writers of the suffrage movement. She was, in some ways, sort of the Thomas Jefferson of the suffrage movement. She was the author of the Declaration of Sentiments, which came out in 1848, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, and which historians typically think of the start of the women's right movement, because it's the first time that anybody said, we'd like to have the vote. And Elizabeth was brilliant and she was charming, and believe me, she knew it. She was also flawed, and there are a lot of things about her that you can look back and see, weren't as great. But what I find myself as a mom sort of relating to is that she had 7 kids and she had real problems finding good childcare. And being the original thinker that she was, she raised her kids in sort of this free range style that was very different from the conventions of the time. And believe me, her kids who show up a lot, they can be a real handful. At one point, actually, her oldest children tied corks. This is a true story. Her oldest children tied corks to the baby and put him in a nearby pond to see if he would float. not a good idea. Fortunately, her friend Susan B. Anthony was on hand and was able to make sure that it did not have an unhappy ending. But her style seemed to have worked in general, since 6 of her 7 children would go on to college, including both of her daughters, which was very unusual at the time. And there's one particular letter that she writes that I really love, where Stanton is complaining about she has to feed and clothe and get shoes for all of her children and find teachers for them and take them to the dentist. And I remember reading it and thinking, I didn't even know they had dentists back then. So she always seems very modern to me. And speaking of women who seem very modern, Alice Paul was absolutely amazing at getting publicity for the cause. She's somebody who I think we need today. Rebecca, what tactics do you see activists using that they borrowed from the suffragists?
So Alice Paul joined the movement as a college student. She went to Swarthmore outside of Philadelphia, and she wasn't super active in the movement there, but then she went to grad school in England. And England had a very active suffrage movement that was also a little more radical than the American movement. They were planting bombs, and they were staging big riots, and they were slapping policemen in the face to get arrested on purpose. They were a lot edgier than the American movement was. And Alice Paul thought that was really exciting. And so when she came back to America, she took a lot of those tactics that she had seen work in England and used them here. But she didn't ever break the law. She sort of drew the line at doing things that would get people to judge her for being sort of a vandal or just a troublemaker. But she invented a bunch of things. And this is why I think the suffrage movement is so interesting to study. Like, you can say, yeah, it's important to remember that this changed democracy, which is true. You can say it's important to remember that women also made history, which is true. You can say it's important to know how our laws and constitution change in this country, all true. But also they were really good. They succeeded. And so if you look at what they did, you see contemporary activists stealing their tactics all the time. So this picture behind me is women picketing the White House. The suffragists invented that. No one had ever stood in front of the White House with picket signs before they did it. I am right now about 4 blocks away from the White House. I promise if I walk down there right now, there will be somebody, even though it's really cold in Washington today, holding a picket sign in front of the White House. They're there pretty much every day of the year, no matter what's going on. And the suffragists did it first. All those parades down Pennsylvania Avenue, you see footage of them all the time. Whatever people are protesting, whatever point people are trying to make, marching from the Capitol, the legislative branch, to the White House, the executive branch. It's symbolic. Pennsylvania Avenue is a big, broad street. It looks really great in pictures. The suffragists did it first. There had never been a civil rights march in Washington, right down the corridors of federal power, before Alice Paul had that idea in 1913, over 100 years ago. But you also keep seeing things that have a contemporary aspect to them, right? Like, look at these picket signs behind me. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? You know what those are? They're tweets, right? They're the 20th century version of a tweet, where the women had to literally sew their message into a banner and hold it up in front of the White House. But what they're doing is making a message go viral with the tools they had back in the day. If they had Twitter, they would have been completely unstoppable. I can only imagine what that is. But once you start looking for ways the suffragists did things in contemporary activism, you see them everywhere. Look at the sashes they're all wearing, right? And then think about the Women's March in 2016, right after Trump was elected, when everybody was wearing pink hats with ears. That whole idea of having a uniform look, something people will take pictures of, something that makes the people participating feel like they're part of a team. That was all from the suffrage movement. And you just keep, seeing it no matter where you go. What do you think, Lucinda? What are some of the lessons that you think contemporary activists can learn?
Aha. Okay, you know what's coming right now.
I do.
I'm going to talk about one of the people who I think is the most interesting in the suffrage movement. Okay, Frances Willard. In the chat, if any of you have ever heard of Frances Willard, say something and I will be completely surprised. Today, she's someone almost no one has heard of her. But in the late 1800s, she was arguably the second most widely known and admired woman in the world after Queen Victoria. And for 20 years, she was the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest and most influential women's group of the 19th century by a long shot. And she wasn't just an activist, she was a full-fledged celebrity. She was huge. Imagine a cross between like Beyonce and Dolly Parton. That's how big she was. She was the kind of person who was so big she could write a book on virtually anything and it would become successful. And she did write a lot of books. In fact, she wrote one just for girls entitled How to Win, and another on how to ride a bicycle, which was, the new big thing of the day. She was so popular that when she died unexpectedly in 1898, tens of thousands of people came by her coffin to pay their respects. We talk a lot about statues today and in Statuary Hall. In 1905, she became the first woman to get a statue in Statuary Hall in the US Capitol, and she would not be joined by another woman for 50 years. So that's all to say that she was a really big deal. Now, these days, temperance means not having alcohol. And in these days, people kind of roll their eyes at the idea of temperance and the movement to abolish alcohol, if they even know what temperance is. But back in the 19th century, drinking was a real public health problem. I mean, you could argue it's a public health problem today, but in ways very similar to the opioid epidemic today. And even though women were significantly less likely to actually drink themselves or be alcoholics, they were especially vulnerable. Remember, for many women who were married, you didn't own your own wages. Your husband could legally beat you. It was really hard to get a divorce. And if you did, it was really hard to make a living. There weren't a lot of professions that were open to you besides cook and housekeeper and teacher. So it was an issue. Temperance was an issue a lot of women cared about. More than that, because it was seen as a moral issue, it was acceptable for women to get involved in temperance, and women did in huge numbers. Now, what Frances Willard did for the suffrage movement was to bring the movement mainstream. People had heard about the idea before, thanks to the work of early suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and a whole bunch of others. But by no means was like even in the top 10 issues that people cared about. It was really down low. And Willard started to change that. And we know from reading her letters that basically Willard was team suffrage from the very beginning, but she's very careful how she sells it to her members. Most suffragists at the time were saying that women should have the vote because it was fair and morally right. And there are a lot of arguments you'll find today where people talk about something being fair and morally right. Willard took a different tactic. Willard makes a completely different argument by saying, you need to think about why people want to do it. And her brand was being a nice, respectable Methodist that everybody liked. And she used this image to her advantage. She talked about how mothers needed to vote for public policies that would be good for their families. She called it the home protection ballot. She talked about citizen motherhood. And this was brilliant marketing because at the time, there was this idea that women should really stay at home, and they talked about a women's sphere was the proper place for women was at home and mothering, all those sorts of things. And she just finds a way to flip it and say, well, of course you need mothers to be involved in all these things. And suddenly it made it acceptable. And this was what made it work for her mostly white, mostly evangelical Christians to improve of what was still a very radical idea. This is sort of a master class in engaging a wider audience, and linking your cause to popular goals is all about. It's not just why it's something that's right, but it's sort of what's in it for the rest of us if we do this goal. And she proved it. It's doing this popular thing. Temperance had a wide number of people who cared about it, and she brought them on board of suffrage because they cared about temperance. And by focusing on something that people already approved of, it completely changed the debate. It reminds me a lot of modern day activism when the gay rights movement championed marriage equality. And that sort of changed how things happened. But what about you, Rebecca? What do you think today activists can learn, especially young activists?
I think there's so much because the suffrage movement went on for so long, right? You mentioned that it was 72 years. If we date it from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and you can make an argument that it actually started before then, but the suffragists themselves like to say that it was born in 1848 at Seneca Falls. So let's start there. The 19th Amendment wasn't ratified until 1920. It's a really, really long time. Almost none of the women who were at Seneca Falls lived to see the ratification. one lived to see the ratification. So it encompassed so many years and so long that there were people doing every kind of thing. And I think that if you want to be an activist now, you can look back and say, okay, I'm not great at public speaking. That's not really my thing, but I can write the hell out of a great sentence and really get people involved. And you see someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who she couldn't go out and give speeches because she had all those children, but she wrote amazing speeches and then handed them off to Susan B. Anthony to deliver herself. Or you can say, like, I'm not a writer or a speaker, but I am the most organized person in the entire world. And boy, can I put on a great event. And you look at someone like Lucy Burns, who people don't even know today, but all the moving parts of the huge 1913 suffrage parade, organizing all the women who ended up going to jail. These pickets behind me, they were arrested. They weren't breaking any laws, but they were arrested and sent to jail anyway for obstructing the traffic on the sidewalk, which is not a thing. But then you had to keep track of who had a lawyer, who was being bailed out, what state they were originally from. It was a lot of moving pieces. Lucy Burns, amazing at organization. Or you can think, you know what? I'm really artistic. My talent is in designing something that's going to look great and people are going to pick it up. And you think about Nina Allender, who was this cartoonist who came up with the Allender girl, who was a sort of caricature of a suffragist, because before Nina Allender started drawing her cartoons, the anti-suffragists always drew suffragists as these like nasty, witchy looking women with terrible clothes and like a big hairy wart over here and a tooth sticking out over this way. And the whole idea was that only terrible, ugly women who can't catch a man are interested in suffrage. And Nina Allender is like, that is total nonsense, and created these drawings of lovely young women who were smart and fierce and held their chins up with confidence. And so there's something for everyone to do, no matter what your talent is, no matter how much time you have, no matter how much money you have. And I feel like because the suffrage movement took so long and involved so many people, you can find a model for whatever it is. And kind of the only wrong answer is not doing anything, and it can feel really daunting. That's where the long length of this movement is a lesson as well, because you can think, God, nothing is happening, right? In fact, we might even go backwards if your cause is something like climate change. And you worry that the one big goal you're fighting for, like the suffragists were fighting for a constitutional amendment, which is really, really hard, you're not getting it. And you think, what am I even doing here? Everyone has that moment. Every activist has a moment where they think, is there even a point to this? This is taking forever. But I think you can look back and see the little mini victories along the way that pave the path for the big victory. And you mentioned, Lucinda, all the things that were frustrating and disheartening for women in the 19th century, that it was very hard to divorce even a man who abused you, that they couldn't keep their own wages, that very few women went to college, that if they did get divorced, it was very hard for them to keep custody of their children, that they certainly couldn't send a man to jail for hitting them, things like that if they were married. And all of those things changed along the way because the suffragists were out there moving the line for what was acceptable for women to do. And so even though the 19th Amendment itself took forever, when they first started pushing for it, they thought it would be the 13th Amendment. It was ultimately the 19th Amendment. But there were so many victories. And I feel like that's another big lesson for today's activists, is that if you get frustrated and you feel like it's all taking too long, which of course every activist feels that way, think about like the progress you've made. Try to look back, try to be a historian and think, okay, well, there was a time, suppose your issue is gay rights, right? And you might be wildly frustrated by things going backwards about, legislation in front of states right now, and about censoring books and things like that. But think about when that conversation wasn't even happening, when no one would even raise up the fact that this was an issue and that the hiding of gay youth was massively, massively damaging, right? So it can be a very instructive lesson to see that it's not all just one big thing. And I would also say that the other thing, and this is part of the, like, everyone can contribute. It's like, find your thing. Just find your thing and do it. Go do it tomorrow. Don't wait for some grown up to say it's okay. I think if anything has taught us over the last few years, it's that young people can be activists, right? Look at all the examples of Malala and Greta Thunberg and the Parkland kids. And, you don't need to wait for some adult to tell you what to do. Kids can be activists and kids can make an enormous difference. And sometimes there are limitations to what you can do as a kid, right? Sometimes you do need a grown-up. You need a grown-up to set up your nonprofit, or you need a grown-up to give you permission to use a certain media outlet or something like that. And that's where allies come in. And allyship, I think, has gotten a lot of play recently, but it was really important with the suffrage movement too. And I was hoping Lucinda could talk a little bit about that.
I told you I was going to talk a little bit about the men in the suffrage movement, and I'd like to use this point to talk about the fact that sometimes it can seem, well, if women want the vote, men must be the opposition. And of course, sometimes that was the case. But from the very beginning, there were a lot of men who were great allies. And at first, it was a trickle because, frankly, there weren't a lot of women who were interested or knew much or thinking about women's suffrage. But over time, it grew and grew till it became a majority. And this is important because we have to remember that women didn't actually have the opportunity to vote for suffrage themselves. They had to convince men to vote for it on their behalf. Now, at the very beginning in Seneca Falls in 1848, when 300 people, women and men, gathered together in Seneca Falls to vote on the Declaration of Sentiments, originally there were a number of different points they were voting, but the one that was really controversial at the time was the idea if women should have the right to vote. All of the people there, and there were a lot of Quakers, they were sort of the really woke group at the time. They were all behind the idea that women should get an education and have the opportunities to maybe control their own inheritance or something like that. But they were a lot less sure about whether women should be allowed to vote. And it looked like that part of the Declaration of Sentiments wouldn't pass. And if that had been the case, we wouldn't even be talking about it until one man who happened to be attending because he was a friend of one of the people organizing it stood up, Frederick Douglass. And he said that having been enslaved himself, he knew what it was like not to have power. And his words so moved the rest of the people there that it managed to pass the vote. It was kind of a squeaker, but it got through. So from the very beginning, the whole women's suffrage movement had allies starting with Frederick Douglass and going all the way through. But because this is the Capitol Historical Society, I want to particularly talk about when they finally managed to get it passed, the story about getting it passed in the House the first time, because it's such a great story to my mind. Now, the thing to remember, and I apologize, I'm losing my voice, about constitutional amendments is they're like the legislative equivalent of doing 5 Ironman triathlons in a row. They are so hard, unbelievably, insanely hard to pass. And that's the reason why there are only 27 of them. Now, in the case of suffrage, they need the men to vote. You have to have 2/3 of each chamber of Congress has to vote for an amendment to pass. Now, in 1918, there was one woman who had just been elected to the House of Representatives, Jeanette Rankin, the first woman from Congress ever. She was from Montana, and she was the first woman to serve in Congress. And she happened to take the lead in introducing the amendment, and she was able to vote for it. It was a very dramatic vote. And the whole thing comes down to the wire. Remember, you've got to have 2/3 of the vote. And there were 4 pro-suffrage congressmen who were literally brought in on stretchers because they were sick or something had happened to them, and they wanted to make sure they could be there for the vote, including Thetis Sims of Tennessee. And he had broken his shoulder, but he refused to have it set because he didn't want to be knocked out and not be able to vote. And then after he did the vote, he stayed there instead of leaving to go and have a doctor take care of him. He wanted to stay there and sort of tell the rest of the people, you really need to vote, make them feel guilty. This is a very good tactic to get them to vote. And he wanted to convince them to vote aye. And then there's Frederick Hits. He came down from New York. He's a representative from New York, and he came down from the deathbed of his wife, who was a big suffragist. And she literally told him on her deathbed, I want you to go and make sure you vote for suffrage. So he goes down, casts his vote, and he turns around to go pass her funeral. And it's a good thing that he came and all these other congressmen did, because it only passed by 1 vote in 1918. So they needed every one of those male allies. And when it finally passed, the women who were watching up in the galleries, they poured into the hallways singing the old 100th hymn, which praised God from whom all blessings flow. So here's the big bummer. Then it fails in the Senate. And so it's really hard. They had to start it all over again. But President Wilson, who was president at the time, and he was determined, he wanted to get this whole thing over with. He was really tired. He called a special session of Congress. And by next June of 1919, both chambers had finally passed it. Unfortunately, Jeanette Rankin didn't get to vote in the second vote when it really passed because she had left office. She was there the first time for just 2 years. After that, it has to go to the states, and you need to get 36 of the then 48 states. Their legislatures have to amend it, and it has to be both houses again. So it's a high bar. And at first, all the states are racing to compete to see who can pass it first. As you might imagine, the states that passed it first are the states that happen to have women already voting, because you don't want to piss off all the women by somehow voting against this. But as they get closer and closer, the new states start to dry up. In most of the South, the states were completely against it, in a large part tied to issues of racism and being afraid that Black women were voting. And that's a real stain on the suffrage movement, that far too often some of the suffragists wound up being willing to try to appease Southerners to try to get them on board. It didn't work for most of the states, but they get down to the final state. It's pretty clear that Tennessee is going to be the state where suffrage either passes or fails. Everybody else is either for it or against it. And it comes down to the wire, and everybody, once they know what's happening in Tennessee, everybody rushes down there, and it's absolutely crazy. And the liquor lobby is there. I talked about the temperance movement, Francis Willard. So they're trying to make sure that it doesn't pass, because they're afraid if women can vote, they'll outlaw liquor, which actually they'd already done. But there you go. They had good reason to be afraid. And they call it the War of the Roses, because if you wear a red rose, you're against suffrage. And if you wear a yellow rose, you're pro-suffrage. And in one house, it doesn't pass, and they think it's going to be stopped in the Senate. That's the place they're going to table it. And they're so sure that they're going to be able to end this right here. They call a vote, and there's a young man, Harry Burns, who is only 24, and he happens to be wearing a red rose. So originally, he had been against the suffrage amendment, but he gets a letter from his mother that day, and she writes him, and she says, "You need to vote for this. This is very important." And essentially changes his mind. And the last minute, he votes for it, and it passes. So I always like to tell my kids, listen to your mom. That's the most important advice you can get. But there were men from the very beginning all the way through the end who were great allies, were very helpful, did a lot to support it. And I think that's important to remember. Now, we talk a lot in our book about what the suffragists did right. But we also, as I mentioned, want to learn from their mistakes. Becca, what did the suffragists get wrong?
Oh, lots, plenty. And as you said, Lucinda, it was really important to us to highlight their mistakes. I think it's tempting when you write about women in history, because they're left out of so many history books, to pretend they're perfect and say they were all brilliant and wonderful and did the right thing all the time to show why they should be in the history books. But first of all, it's really bad history. Nobody is perfect and makes the right decision all the time. Also, really boring. You want to hear about these people as real human beings who had real flaws and made mistakes. But also, the point of our book is so that you can learn how to be an activist yourself. And first of all, you don't want to make the same mistakes they did. So we want to point out their mistakes so that you can learn from them. But also, we want you to be inspired to change the world yourself. And if you think you have to be perfect and some once in a generation genius to make a difference, then maybe you're going to feel like it can't be you. Maybe you think you are a once in a generation genius, in which case rock on. But if you think that you've got flaws like everybody else, like me, like Lucinda, like all of us, then I think it can be really helpful to see that the people who have changed the world are also flawed. So some of it was just some bad calls on tactics, right? Lucinda mentioned that there had been this whole moral thing. You should support women's right to vote because it is the right thing to do. Well, that doesn't convince a lot of people. The right thing to do is not a great argument. They really had to figure out, because they needed men to support suffrage for them, men had nothing to gain from women voting, it looked like on the surface. So they had to figure out a better way to tell that story and make that message. I think they made some mistakes about not including a wide enough group of women. A lot of the suffrage groups tended to be wealthy women, white women, women who didn't have to work for a living. Because if you are planning parades and luncheons and pickets in front of the White House, you're not including people who work in a factory. You're not including people who can't get to town in a car. And I think that not only is that a mistake in terms of the success of your movement, it's a mistake in terms of what your message is, right? Because you're only listening to a certain segment of society. You're only listening to the needs of certain people. And that is going to lead you to make some of those wrong decisions. So the more diverse voices are in the room, the more different points of view you have represented, the stronger your movement's going to be. I think where this really showed up with the suffrage movement was they really allowed some racism to dictate some of the causes in the movement. And it popped up in certain ways. So Lucinda mentioned that a lot of Southern states were against women's suffrage because they didn't want Black women to vote. Black men were allowed to vote by the Constitution, but a lot of Southern states were putting huge limits on that with what was called Jim Crow laws, right? They were instituting some really unfair tests and laws to make it harder and harder for Black men to vote, even though legally Black men were supposed to. And the governments of the Southern states were happy with that strategy. They didn't want a whole new group of Black voters, and they were going to hold firm on that. And white women suffragists knew that was a thing. And so there are examples of white women suffragists going to Southern states saying, there are more white women here than Black women. If you acknowledge that women should vote, the white vote will overwhelm the Black vote, and it will be a way of ensuring white supremacy. That was an argument that was made by suffragists. There were also examples about individual women who were not included in things. Ida B. Wells, who you all might know about, she was a very famous journalist and activist, anti-lynching activist mainly. She was a suffragist. She very much wanted a voice in the big suffrage movement and felt that the white women in charge were ignoring her, and ended up founding what was called the Alpha Suffrage Club that was specifically for Black women. And it wasn't just about her not getting time on the stage. It was that the white women weren't paying attention to the fact that Black women had different needs and needed different things from the movement. And that was a very obvious moment of racism in this 1913 parade that I've talked about a couple of times that marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. There's a big university here in Washington, Howard University, a historically Black college. And there was a sorority there at Howard that formed right then, right as that parade was being planned, because they wanted to be politically active. Delta Sigma Theta is the name of the sorority. They wanted to be politically active and they wanted to march in that parade. And so they wrote to Alice Paul and said, we're this group of young women at Howard University. We have a dedication to service. We want to be involved in this parade. And she didn't answer their letter right away. And she kind of hemmed and hawed and she ignored them. And she got a note from the big head of the suffrage movement, Carrie Chapman Catt, saying, you can't ignore them. You need to answer this. We are inclusive. But Alice Paul was really worried that if it was an integrated parade, if Black people marched with white people, then a lot of the white people would drop out. And she was much more interested in protecting the feelings of the white women than in including the Black women. And so she told the sorority, Delta Sigma Theta, that they could march in the parade, but they had to march together as a group in the back of the parade, segregated in the back of the parade. And you read about things like that now, and you think, God, do better. How can you devote your life to a political issue of equality and fairness and having a voice in your government and being a part of democracy, and then turning around and being overtly racist that way? And you can make an argument that there was different times and all of that, but you want them to do better. And I want all of us to do better, which is why it was really important to us to include their mistakes, particularly racism, in our book. I will say that on the 100th anniversary of the 1913 March in 2013, the Deltas led the parade. So you can see progress. You can see progress. I would not for one single second say there's no racism in America anymore, but you can see where time has made some difference over it. So that I think was a big thing that we took on when we started researching and writing this book. We really wanted to make sure that we weren't just saying everyone was brilliant and perfect. And you know, I think we were surprised by some of the research we did and some of the things we did. Lucinda, were you? Were there things that surprised you?
There's lots of things that I learned doing this, and actually I'll mention two. The first one that surprised me was that back in the 19th century, and the women were not expected. It's not just that women didn't speak in public, which was highly controversial. And there's lots of references to the time that when women started going out and giving speeches, crowds would throw things at them, and they'd be, or they'd show up just because it was this crazy, unbelievable thing that was happening. A woman was giving a speech. You know, that was an oddity. Going to speeches was kind of something you did for fun back in the 19th century because, well, they didn't have a lot of other options. But women weren't even supposed to applaud. So it's not just that you couldn't get up on stage and say something. You also weren't supposed to, you know, clap your hands and make any noise. So there are all these references to, if you had a bunch of women in your crowd, they would wave their handkerchiefs. And I'm thinking, wow, that is something that I didn't know and that really sort of changed, because it seems so innocuous. You know, what's wrong with applauding? But women weren't supposed to make noise. I guess the other thing, though, that really, really surprised me, and I still have trouble wrapping my head around it, was that there were women against suffrage. Now, there were two main groups who were really working hard against women's suffrage. And obviously the National Liquor Lobby was a big one, but the other one was the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, which to my surprise was largely run by women. And they were well organized, and they were politically savvy, and they were determined women. Now, there are some women who didn't think women should have anything at all to do with politics because it was so dirty, and they felt that their husbands and their brothers and their sons would all vote in their best interests. And I want to just say, yeah, okay. But there were others who were reformers themselves, and they argued that if women could vote, they could be nonpartisan experts, and the men would be more likely to listen to their advice. I don't particularly buy that argument, but this is what many of them believe. Here's an excerpt. I'm going to read you a little something from a petition that we found when I worked at the National Archives, with a masthead that's filled with nearly 30 women. I don't know if you probably can't see it at all. This is a facsimile. It's not the real thing. Nearly 30 women, and they're all Mrs. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so of here, and Mrs. So-and-so of there, and it's something stuff. And it reads, it would give suffragists and socialites the opportunity to annoy and pester every legislator in the United States until a majority of the men and 36 legislators surrendered their judgment and principles to political threats and cajolery. It would mean that no legislature in the United States could meet without being surrounded by suffrage pickets. It would be an official endorsement of nagging as a national policy. I'm like, really? You're writing this stuff? They go on, it said, it would give every radical woman the right to believe that she could get any law she wanted passed by pestering her city, it's quote marks, pestering her city council, her legislature, her congressman, or her president, no matter how the people voted, nor what national crisis existed. And if feminism can be put through by pestering, regardless of the will of the people, so can pacifism, socialism, and other isms. I'm thinking, what, the will of the people? Who are you talking about that you're missing half the people? You know, you can laugh when you read this, but, you know, actually, I kind of want to cry. But they were a well-organized, tough foe. Becca, what do you think? What do you think we can learn from the suffrage movement on how to handle the opposition?
I mean, I think there were so many things the suffragists got right on handling opposition. We talked about some of the things they got wrong in terms of like, you should support me because I am morally correct. But I think one of the really smart things they did was figure out what people were scared of. Because as you mentioned, there were a lot of reasons to be opposed to suffrage. And there were the like garden variety sexists, right? There were some people who just thought women were too stupid or fragile to handle the vote. You were never going to change their minds. Don't even try with that, right? There's just going to be a certain segment of people who are always going to be opposed to you. And it's too bad that there they are. I think the much more interesting things is how do you handle opposition where there is a little room to change their mind, right? So if women were worried that voting or taking a voice in politics made them unwomanly in some way, that got their hands dirty, that made them sort of elbow their way into the men's world in a way that wasn't quite nice or seemly. That's where the images of Nina Allender's cartoons, things like that, made such a difference. And women being out in public doing this work, but still having manners and morals and all the things they were worried about. As it happened, World War I also intervened at this time, and women ended up in a lot of public roles that they hadn't played before because the men were off at war, and that made a big difference to that segment of opposition. People who worried that their husbands and sons, already had their vote taken care of, and that they would just be doubling up on that point of view. How do you address that? Do you show that husbands and sons don't always vote in the woman's interest? Or do you show that there's a way towards growing that support? Like, who can we appeal to where doubling that vote actually is an asset, right? And I think that the other thing that these women did really, really well, that is a big lesson for activists, is like, manage your own message and manage it early, because somebody else is going to define it for you. And so, political cartoons are a really great research source for seeing how people felt about things. And there are all these cartoons. I mentioned the creepy warty ladies, but after the creepy warty ladies, there are always these cartoons of a woman with a Votes for Women banner, and she's marching out of the house, and there's some pathetic man in the back, and he's always got some screaming baby on one hip. There's always dirty laundry and maybe a boiling over kettle. And it's this notion that if she goes out to vote for the 20 minutes it's going to take her to go vote, that the household is just going to absolutely go to pot, because this poor helpless man can't possibly handle the baby and the laundry and the kettle while she's out voting. So that telegraphs exactly what people are scared of. That's such a window into how do you couch that opposition to say, either you can handle the baby, it's gonna be fun, or understand that one of the things I'm voting for is making it so that this household is better supported, so that we have more access to me earning a wage, or we have more access to healthier food or better health care, or all of the things that actually make this family more successful. And it's not just the 20 minutes I'm spending at the poll. So it feels like, because it went on so long and there were so many people against it from different points of view, it's a big masterclass in figure out who your opposition is, figure out what they're scared of, and figure out what message is going to change their minds, or not, or decide that you're never going to change their mind and then don't waste your time. That happens too. I know we are really running down to the end of the hour here. I want to make sure we get a chance to answer any questions. I know Jane Campbell is looking at those.
I'm here. And so, yeah, we've got, someone asks, the fight isn't over yet. How do you guys feel about the Equal Rights Amendment being ratified but not certified? And what advice would you give to the next generation of suffragists who are trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed?
So I will say at the outset, both Lucinda and I serve on the board of the National Archives Foundation, and the National Archives is part of the legislative fight over the ERA and ratifying the ERA. So there's a certain amount of stuff we just can't talk about in public because of our involvement with the archives. I will say that ERA is a really interesting case study if you want to learn how hard it is to amend the Constitution. And it should be hard to amend the Constitution. That's why it's lasted for as long as it has, right? Because it doesn't swing with fads. But I think that there is a lot to learn about the tactics of individual states and figuring out what message works over time. It is absolutely true that the ERA is an extension of the suffrage movement. In fact, Alice Paul wrote the very first draft of the ERA in 1923, so just a few years after the 19th Amendment was ratified. It is absolutely the same historic through line. I think, for I'd be curious to see if Lucinda has anything to add, but I think that for activists who are frustrated with the ERA, all the things we just said hold true, right? The fight can take a long time. There have been small victories along the way. Make sure you're finding the right allies. Make sure you're tailoring your message to the right opposition.
Yeah, I think Becca, you covered some of the most important stuff. I guess two other points that I would make that are be useful for people today is, first, it matters what story you tell. And that's something that suffragists eventually got very good at doing. And part of that was, I talked about Frances Willard, and she told this story about how the world was going to be a better place for women voting, not just for women, but for everyone. And I think a lot of times we kind of get hung up on having lists of things. These are the 27 things we're going to do, and these are the statistics and all that stuff. And the truth is, people don't tend to remember statistics and lists and things like that. They do remember a good story, which is why some of the most effective suffrage speakers would tell a story that really resonated with their audience. Someone I think about often was Lucy Stone, who was really one of the very first women to get out and speak about suffrage. She also spoke against slavery. She was an abolitionist. And those two causes, the more she learned about the role of that enslaved women, what happened to them, she started thinking about what happened to women. And she started telling that story when she would get up to audiences. And one of the times she got heckled in front of a large audience, and someone said, "You're just a disappointed woman." And Lucy Stone, by that point, was such a good speaker. She would draw these huge crowds, and even people who thought this was scandalous that women would speak in public, they had to admit she was really pretty good at it. She could think on her feet. She said, "Of course I'm a disappointed woman." She turned around and created one of her sort of iconic speeches of the disappointed woman. And she talked about how she had been disappointed by the laws. She'd been disappointed by the fact that she didn't have an opportunity to get an education, how she was disappointed by the fact that she wasn't able to fully participate in the church the way that she wanted to. She talked about how she was disappointed in love because the way that it was structured, that men had all the economic power, meant that instead of trying to find somebody she wanted to marry for love, she had to think about it as sort of this strategy: who's going to make enough money to keep me and my children safe? And she gave this disappointed woman speech. It was very, very successful, and it resonated with people. They could hear that story that she was telling, and it stuck with them. So first, I would say, tell a good story. That is really something it's worth. And the other part of it is, sometimes when you get stuck, try something new, do something bold and different. And Becca, a lot of the things that the suffragists did in the early 20th century are things where they said, okay, we've been trying to do these same things that the first generation, even the second generation have done. Let's try these new tactics. There will be different tactics today. That doesn't mean that it's always going to be standing in front of the White House with a placard or a petition or something like that. That's going to be what makes it. But trying something new will give you a chance to learn what works and what communicates.
We have a question now, and I think this is from a teacher. She wants to know if you have any words of encouragement for the kids who are taking up the activism banner, organizing walkouts, social media, and such. And she also wants to know, what advice would you give to educators that are trying to support and nurture these young people in their activism?
An interesting question. I'll take the kids. Lucinda, maybe you can take the educators. I would say, when we were first planning this book, we talked about whether we needed to include in our introduction a little sort of cheerleading, like, you can do it, you can be an activist. And we realized we didn't have to do that, because kids know they can be activists. They have examples all around. They are very confident in their views. You guys are smart. You guys are informed. You guys know that you can make a difference. And so we didn't have to, as 50-something moms, give anybody permission to do that. So I would say, like, rock on, activists. I am really impressed. I am, both Lucinda and I have teenage kids, Although two of mine have now hit their 20s, we are really, really impressed with younger activists and how they feel like this world is theirs to change. And so I'm not sure they need any encouragement from us. I would say if you have kids in your life that you wish were more activists and you want to kind of underline for them that there is a role for them in getting involved in whatever issue lights their fire. Sometimes you're not the right spokesperson, right? I think that we've gotten asked in the past, how do you encourage young people to register to vote? And again, I'm not sure it's Lucinda and me who are going to be the ones who make the difference. Happily, there are 1,000 other spokespeople for voting rights, and they are younger than us, and they are browner than us, and they are cooler than us, and they have different platforms than us, and they are on TikTok, and they are, so sometimes the difference is finding the right messenger.
And I guess if I was going to add anything to that, I would say one of the things that really hit home for us in writing this book is very often you'll have different wings of the suffragist movement pitted against each other. And they'll say that this is the radical group and this is the moderate group. And the truth is you need both. And the analogy I like to use is that, your radicals move the goalposts and your moderates move the ball. And I think that that is something to keep in mind when you're thinking about these big changes. You don't have to be one or the other. You don't even, if you're more moderate or if you're more radical, you don't even necessarily have to agree or like or get along with or be texting the people in other camps. But the fact that you have lots of different approaches going at it makes a movement much more successful. In the end, you could never have passed suffrage. The radicals from the radical things they were doing, protesting in front of the White House and having the hunger strikes and even the parade and things like that, that got an enormous amount of awareness and publicity, but that alone wouldn't have been enough. The moderates, who are doing a lot of the work lobbying behind the scenes, and sometimes what they're doing is they're saying, well, we're the sane ones, you may not like those guys, but we'll give you a reason and excuse why you can run on. They wouldn't have had the attention. They wouldn't have had the spotlight on the issue if it hadn't been for what the radicals were doing. And again, they didn't like each other quite often, but they did together, all working together, manage to make something happen. And specifically to the point of students, I would say probably one of the most important things you can remind students is do their homework. And I don't mean just the homework for, every day. Organization does pay. It's not very sexy, but it plays a huge role in getting everything done. Making sure that, and Rebecca was talking about how, who's been arrested and what state are they from and who's going to bail them out and getting all that stuff. There are parts for organization in almost everything that you do. Just knowing who's on the roll list, who are we going to be in touch with, who are we going to lobby. That's all very important. And I think sometimes you get caught up in the excitement and you miss that sort of aspect of it, that, a lot of work does get done behind the scenes. And so that's something I think teachers can sort of remind students that it's not going to happen by magic just because they go out there. A lot of their success will be built on the fact that they've done all that work behind the scenes.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. So let me first, I want to thank you both for your time, for your talent, for having written this book. Here's the book. What we will do, several people have asked, is this video going to be available? This video will be available. We're going to send a link to it to everyone who was registered, and included will be information on how to get the book from your favorite, bookseller. And we also put this video on, we have a digital hub of educational resources for teachers called the We the People Constitution Tour. This is a story of people who amended the Constitution or advocated for the amendment of the Constitution. So it'll be available through that network as well. And we also want to remind all of our listeners, thank you for the classrooms who tuned in. everyone, these are available because of the donations that we get from our members and our donors, and we thank you very much. Our speakers volunteered their time to be with us, and so we thank them for making that contribution. And we want to remind you about some upcoming events. We have coming up, we're starting a new series about the history and meaning of the United States Constitution and the ways in which it has been amended. So it will probably take us a year and a half to do that series. We are starting on Friday, April 1st, this Friday, with Pulitzer Prize winning historian Jack Rakove, who is going to talk to us about the Constitutional Convention itself and the debate that they had about how should the Constitution be able to be amended. And then on the 14th of April, which happens to be in the ready for Holy Week and Passover, we're going to talk about the First Amendment as a place to establish religious liberty. And we have for that Stephen Waldman, who's written a book called Founding Faith, the First Amendment and Religious Liberty. We also have coming up, both in person and virtually, an event on April 26th at 10:30 in the morning to celebrate Ulysses S. Grant. Excuse me, it's his 200th birthday. And we also are going to celebrate, it is the 100th birthday of the Grant Memorial being placed at the Capitol on the near to the reflecting pool, and it has just been restored. So we are going to have Senator Roy Blunt, who has been a real advocate for getting this done, the architect of the Capitol, Brett Blanton, who's going to talk about the restoration, and New York Times bestselling author Ronald White, talking about President Grant and how his legacy has been reimagined as we understand the role that he played in trying to bring the country together after the Civil War. So we hope you'll join us for those events. Thank you again, Rebecca, Lucinda. We appreciate very much your being with us, and we look forward to the next adventure.